Migrating Azure DevOps Server to the Cloud with Martin Hinshelwood.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host for helping you and your teams move fast, deliver quality, and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. This podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm that serves companies who are building mission-critical software. And quick announcement, we're in the second full year of my architect forums, and we'll include a link in the show notes. But if you lead a team of software engineers and you're looking to collaborate with other peers who are also doing the same, just go ahead and sign up at the link in the show notes, and we'd love to have you join us. And for those who are looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, you can just search for it in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. And my guest today on the show is Martin Hinshelwood. He is a passionate Agile leader with a track record of inspiring and encouraging and igniting momentum. He's a featured speaker, author, and industry thought leader, and has a strong track record of helping organizations build a vision and execute evolutionary and revolutionary change. His deep technical knowledge, business insight, and experience drive impactful change for organizations. He's been a technologist turned agilist, and Martin successfully helps organizations decentralize and democratize and evolve their way of working to build extraordinary processes and drive organizational change through culture, technology, and teamwork. And he's been recognized by Microsoft as a Microsoft MVP, and he's also the maintainer of the open source project Azure DevOps Migration Tools. Martin, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Thank you for inviting me on.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. You are one of the few people who's just deeply embedded in the Azure DevOps server as a product and migrating from instance to instance. And you've done so much work in that space. I want to ask you about that, but you've done so much just in the way of custom software in general. If you could back up and kind of look at your career, what are the moments, the big moments that kind of steered you into what you're working in today? Because it's not like you can go to the university and say, you know what, I want to end up here, and it just happens. So what's been your journey?
Yeah, I was actually reflecting on that on Monday, yesterday as well. And I think something that's always been true, I think it's still true, is software engineers are expected just to know what they're doing, and they don't get any training. I didn't get any training in my entire career until I stopped doing software engineering and started doing Agile and Scrum and those kind of things. But the thing that kind of tipped me into the DevOps world was realizing how much we kind of suck at building software. And how many, my favorite little sticker from the MVP Summit is friends don't let friends right-click publish.
Right.
And there was so much of that going on. I started my career as a software engineer in 2001, straight out of university, building websites for new media agencies. And then I went on to work for Merrill Lynch, big bank, and Greco, an engineering company. And I realized fairly early on that almost everybody has no idea what they're doing in building software. So I kind of dropped into that idea of helping them do it better. And because my skills were in software engineering and they were starting to use TFS back in the day, Team Foundation, Visual Studio Team System.
Pre-2018?
I started poking the APIs for that. I think I started in 2007 working with Visual Studio Team System. I think it was shipped in early 2007. And yeah, I never looked back. That was ultimately how I got my MVP in the first place. I've been an MVP for 15 years. I guess we'll find out at the beginning of next month whether that continues. But this story of helping people has continued. That's been kind of my bag since probably 2006, 2007, is helping other software engineers have a better time, I think is a good way to put it. And that started off in the DevOps space, right? Because that's the shortest leap from technology, right? Is into DevOps. But very quickly you realize that tools don't solve problems. People solve problems, and they'll happily mess up the tool if we let them. So the people are the ones who need the help, which is very difficult. I'm Asperger's, so engaging with people at that level was always very difficult for me. But long practice, getting dropped in at the deep end and speaking at events. I spoke at one of only 2 ever Silverlight code camps. And just keep doing it. If you're not good at, so this is kind of the whole thing with DevOps, right? If you're not good at something, do it more.
Yeah.
If you find something hard, do it more often, do it more frequently, and you'll get better at it. And that's been true for me when I was a kid with dyslexia in school. I read voraciously, which helped me compensate for whatever difficulties dyslexia brought. And then starting to do technology and speaking at conferences, do it more often, build and release more often. All of these things, it's the same story, right? It's the same reason you want to keep doing it, is so that you just get better at it.
Practice. That's all.
Yeah.
So I want to dive into the Azure DevOps Migration Tools.
Yep.
We never really talked about that here on the show. We've talked a lot about how to set up source control properly and what you want to include in your builds and types of testing and deployments and Azure cloud, this and that. But then we have a whole lot of people who are using Azure DevOps Services or Azure DevOps Server. And, well, when you have to do it, you have to do it. And you have to, okay, I need to migrate from one instance to another. It could be Azure DevOps Server to the cloud, or it could be, hey, you know what? This organization is way too big. How do I split it? How do I get some projects? So how did you get in that space and figure out, it's a little bit tricky to move stuff?
I, through the fire of the crucible, basically, as we learn anything. I started working for an organization. I did a stint in Seattle. I lived in Seattle for 3 years. And that's where I really became a DevOps consultant rather than just helping people, like getting paid to help people.
Yeah.
So I did that for 3 years. And then when I moved back to the UK in 2013, I started my own business. And because I had a reasonably popular, successful blog, I just put out a post and I had business flowing in. And I started doing some work with a company in Norway. It's a big organization. It's called Schlumberger. They're a big oil and gas company.
Oh yeah, and there's locations in Texas too.
Yeah, they have locations. I've been to the Texas locations as well. I've been to quite a few of their locations around the world. But the whole problem that they had, which is it's not uncommon, but it's not uncommon in big organizations, right? Is you end up with everything.
Yeah.
And one of the particular products I was working with them, it was a tool for the oil and gas industry that did everything. It was like a Swiss Army knife tool that had been worked on for 25, 30 years. So you can imagine the scale of that. And anytime a competitor came along, they bought them. So absorbed that in and this new functionality and plugins and whatnot. And what they ended up with was 80 to 90 teams in 13 locations in 9 different countries, all working on this product. Each location had its own funding, so they weren't necessarily working towards a common goal, right?
Yeah.
Because they're all working on different things. And they all didn't care what anybody else was doing, so they all had their own source control tools. They're actually another company other than Microsoft that I've met that has a homegrown source control tool, right? Because that's fun.
Yep.
And so they had the source code all over the place, work items all over the place. They didn't have a cohesive strategy. So they had about 10, between 5 and 10 people in a build team
Mhm.
whose job it was to knit the whole thing together with automated builds. And they ended up needing, in order to do continuous, let's call it 24-hourly delivery,
Sure.
right, of a
Once a
usable
day.
working
Once a day.
product. Yeah, once a day. They were doing 11,000 builds a day. 11,000 builds
That's
a day. And each build of the system needed a 120 core machine to run the builds on. I mean, it was massive amounts of infrastructure, massive amounts of servers, massive amounts of people input to pull it all together. And obviously, I'm talking a little bit about source control rather than work items, right? But they discovered a desire to not have that, to not have 90 active branches, to not have 90 different groups doing different things. And they effectively wanted to move to this idea of one ES before Microsoft had even talked about it publicly.
One
right?
engineering system.
One engineering system. That we need to get everybody's stuff in the same place so we're not wondering where the heck it is, whether we've got the truth, and we can simplify and streamline those processes. Cost cutting, right? It's a little bit cost cutting, which is what's happening in the current market as well, right?
And it seems like some companies have adopted this term called platform engineering for that whole one ES concept that Microsoft's adopted. Just, hey, we have a lot of teams. Let's kind of have them doing the same thing. Let's have a strategy around this.
I think for me, it's just that I have this thing. Platform engineering, DevOps, agile, they're all just different lenses looking at the same thing, right? Different colored filters looking at the same thing.
All words for process.
Yeah, all words for let's figure out how we get stuff done well, right? How we have less problems. So they wanted to bring all of this together. So I started cutting my teeth, bringing all of this different stuff, including source control as well, into one place. So I built copious amounts of PowerShell scripts to do this. And at one point, I had a team of 5 people around the world who were running these PowerShell scripts. And I effectively started building them into a command line tool because it's a heck of a lot easier to debug code than it's PowerShell. I don't know if you've had large PowerShell. It's not fun, fun at all.
No.
That's when you want to turn it into an executable. For me, I open sourced it because ultimately I didn't want to support it as a consumer tool, right? That's why I didn't try just monetize it. But also I think it's the type of thing, I thought at the time it would be the type of thing that would add value and people would use. And they do. We can talk about how much they use it in a bit. But the biggest problem is work items. Source code is easy. Right? I mean, it's not. If your source code's in Git, it's easy. Pull, change the origin, push. Woohoo, we're done. We might have some size issues, but that's easy. But work items, there's absolutely nothing to help with that. And that was where I focused my tool originally, was on how do I make a copy of work items from one place to another. And originally it was just, I call it just the tip, right? Just like how you should migrate TFVC, is just take a cut off the top.
Right.
But then I think it was 2012, Microsoft started supporting effectively Time Machine. You can set the changed date to sometime in the past, so that you can start doing proper history migrations. And that my tools were born out of that story. We actually ended up, Schlumberger had, I think, 28 collections, TFS instances around the organization. And they wanted them all in one. We didn't quite get there because it was a lot, but we ended up with one collection that we moved up to Azure DevOps that was, I don't know, 2.6 terabytes, something like that.
Wow.
And they became the 4th largest Azure DevOps user outside of Microsoft. I don't know what the story is now because I'm sure other people have come in, right? They maybe are eclipsed by now, but at the time it was a very big migration. And I do want to caveat something. I have never recommended that anybody use my tools. Because what you should be using is Microsoft's out-of-the-box solution to go from on-prem to ADO. They have a migration service where you can take your entire collection and you can feed it to it. There's various ways that you have to do that. You can feed it this collection and it will import the whole thing. We did the 2.7 terabyte database import in a weekend with Microsoft's like commercial tooling for Microsoft.
Okay.
So that's absolutely the thing that people should be doing. I'm gonna get rid of two groups of people who think they want to use my tools. One is that group who I want to take my collection and put it in ADO. Don't use my tools for that. Use Microsoft's out-of-the-box solution. Okay. Absolutely. That. The other one is probably about 25% of everybody who contacts me and wants to use my tools actually just wants to switch tenant. And that's out of the box as well. You can just go into the settings and you can change from tenant A to tenant B. So if you're a company and you buy another company and you want their ADO to now be under your tenant, you don't need my tools. That's out of the box. You can just go switch the tenant, and it'll even let you map all the users and do all the crazy stuff that you want to do to maintain integrity. So that's probably 50%. Okay. Both of those are probably 50% of people that think they want to use my tools. And that's 50% of the people that call me, and doesn't include all the other people who don't call me and end up doing it anyway. So don't use my tools for those two outcomes. But if your company went down a microservices angle and decided to create 120 projects in ADO, and then you realized that it should be 120 repos in one project and have all the work items together, then Microsoft has a little bit of help for you. They do have the ability to move work items from one project to another now, but only if you're in ADO. So you can do that instead. So let's get rid of those people because they can just do that. But you might want to split or merge if you've got a lot of work items.
You said only if you're in Azure DevOps Services in the cloud?
Yeah, ADO. So yeah, okay. I'm just, I guess for clarity, if I say ADO or Azure DevOps, I mean the cloud. If I say TFS, regardless of version, I mean on-prem. I think it was a silly idea for them to rename the on-prem to Azure DevOps Server and have Azure DevOps Server and Service, because it just leads to confusion. TFS and Azure DevOps, right? That's the way I keep my head straight.
So you prefer to say TFS 2022 and all that, even though Microsoft calls it Server?
I guess because I really stopped using TFS around 2012 when what was it called? TFS Online.
Well, and then Visual Studio Team Services.
Yeah. Whatever renditions, TFS Online. It was various things. And DevOps was the wrong name for it, but let's not go there either. I stopped using TFS when that happened, ostensibly. Okay. And then the last time I really used it was 2016, and that was just for migration purposes. So I tend to think of it as just two products rather than one with lots of versions.
Yeah.
But it does have implications for the Azure DevOps tools. I mean, I was contacted recently by a company who wanted to do a migration into the cloud, and they had TFS 2010.
Yeah.
And this was recently. And I discovered I'm looking, doing an assessment, and I'm like, where's your source code? And they're like, oh yeah, we use VSS for that. I'm like, oh my gosh.
Oh, wow. What a blast from the past.
this stuff is still out there.
Yes.
So the primary use case for my tool is I've got some stuff. So I've got some work items somewhere in Azure DevOps or TFS, and I want them somewhere else in Azure DevOps and TFS. That's pretty much it. I've done TFS to cloud to on-prem. People do that as well because they're strange. I don't know why you would ever want to do that, but companies decide to do it.
Yeah.
Somebody went rogue in the organization, moved them to the cloud, and now they want to go back to on-prem, which is mental, but that's the way people go sometimes. We've bought another company.
So we merged.
Or we've sold part of our company.
Split.
So let's say you want to split a collection, and you're actually splitting individual projects as well. Because the Azure DevOps Migration Tools focuses on the work item level, it's a query-based extractor.
So
you can craft
for terminology. You're saying collection. Is it one and the same project collection to Azure DevOps organization, or is there a nuance there?
Yes. So yes, effectively, collection and organization are the same thing. It's so much so that if you go into your organization and look at the group names, you'll have project collection administrator is the
That's
main.
right. They didn't update the permissions, the permission names.
Yeah. So effectively, a collection is a database. So all of the work items have unique IDs within the context of that database, right? So it's a incrementing ID because they didn't decide to use goods, right? Although goods are bad, but they're also good, right? Because you don't have that problem. And then on the service side, on Azure DevOps, two orgs can technically exist within the context of the same database, but that's a cost-cutting thing for Microsoft, i.e. they need to minimize the amount of physical databases they use, and they put multiple tenants in the same database, right? The same space, same bucket.
Yeah.
But yeah, ostensibly it's the same thing, org and...
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
So the Microsoft Migration Tools and your Azure DevOps Migration Tools, it's not either or, it's use the Microsoft first and then use yours to fill in the gaps when you have some special scenario where Microsoft doesn't help you with that?
So I've had people use my tools to take one project out of on-prem, move it to the cloud because some team wants to go first.
Yeah.
And then 2 years later, they move the whole collection up and that team moves back. Okay. Right? I've seen that happen. I've seen people have multiple things locally, or my tools are something that the developers can use. Putting the collection up tends to not be in lots of organizations. So there are because the server might be owned by operations and not owned by the developers. They may not have access to the SQL Server. They may not have access to get the files they need. They want to go to the cloud, and the operations team's dragging their heels. So they come along, use my tool, and just push their data up and go, bye, thanks for all the fish, right?
Yeah.
They're away. So I wrote a blog post many moons ago called "One Team Project to Rule Them All."
Okay.
And what it was really talking about was this idea that you actually want bigger team projects than smaller ones. If you're an individual developer, you don't want to be working every day inside of multiple ADO projects because you're going to have multiple backlogs. You get multiple things. That's the old ways of matrixing people. That's not how we work today. An agile team, a member of an agile team works in a project and all of their stuff is within the context of that project and they work together towards that goal. Yeah. Which means that lots of teams where in the past they'd created multiple projects actually want one project and they need some way to merge it all together, and that could be quite difficult. Sometimes they created a project for each team and they have 10 teams working on a product and then they want to merge it together and they realize that it's very hard to do.
Yeah.
So that's effectively what my tools do. Is it? Just trying to think how to describe it. Think of it as a wrapper that runs a bunch of different processors that process data in different ways. So one of those processors is the work item migration processor, which will effectively has a source and a target, loads the data from the source and iterates through writing it to the target. But on top of that, sometimes you make a mistake when you're doing that. And what you really want to do is load, you've forgotten a field and you don't want to read your million work items just to get that one field across. So you want to cheat a little bit. So there's kind of I call it the post processor, like the I forgot something processor.
Right.
And you can literally go to the target and just write the latest version over the top.
Okay.
So there's those types of processors around work. There's a work item delete processor because sometimes you want to delete a million work items, right? But also there's things like I want to bring queries across. If I've got a lot of queries that I've set up on my server, I want to bring teams across. I've got 100 teams and I want to bring them across. We've got a pipeline processor, so we can bring your pipelines across as well. There's lots of caveats to that. Can't do classic pipelines, can't do XAML pipelines, can only do the latest pipelines. But it does it, right?
Sure.
So there's lots of different things, but I think the thing that people don't realize in moving let's say we just take work items, right? If you're moving a work item from server A to server B, there's all sorts of things that you don't think about. Because not only, are you familiar with how Azure DevOps stores data?
Oh, it's in SQL, besides SQL Server?
Besides SQL Server, right? It's actually, the old TFS had a horrible schema format that was just mental. But the thing, most work item tracking tools out there don't actually store the full history of work items. They'll say who changed the work items, and they'll record the history of the main things like the state changes for new, active, resolve, closed, whatever it is. Jira does this. There's only specific system fields that are, if you add a custom field, it's not going to record the whole full history of it. It'll just store the data for it. But TFS was always unique in that story that it stores every value of every variable that ever was, which means that you can actually, not through the UI, through the API only, but you can actually do, and you can do an as of query, and you can say, give me this query as it would have looked if I'd run it on this date. And it will give you that, data. So there's loads of crazy things. Most fields have a was ever clause, right? Give me all the work items that are currently open but were ever closed, right? So you can find your reactivations and all kinds of things like that. So in order to maintain that in the new location, you kind of have to go back in time and write the history. But you have to do it for each work item,
right?
Because, and you can't do the link, think of this, you can't do the links right away. If work item A links to work item B, how do I add the links when I'm adding work item A? Well, I can't, because work item B doesn't exist yet. So you've kind of got to, there's a lot of jiggery pokery, is what we would call it in Scotland, a little bit of magic that happens under the covers to enable that. But you've got the actual work item data, the history of the work item, you've got links, you've got attachments, you've got git commit links, because all the GUIDs have changed on everything. So as we're processing the work items, we actually have to go fix all of these things and figure it out. And don't get me started if somebody's done, you remember TFVC?
Yes.
Team Foundation Version Control?
Yep.
There's a tool out there called TFGit.
Yep.
That allows you to clone TFVC as a Git repo.
And try to keep the history.
And try to keep the history. It does its best, right? But it will actually output a mapping file between commit ID and, what's it called? Change set ID and commit ID. And then if you use that as an input to our tool, it'll go fix all the links between the work items and the source code so that it connects to the new Git repo rather than... So there's all kinds of little tools in there that kind of plug in to enable this story of moving data around. And it's really not designed for muggles. Maybe muggles probably a bit rude, right? But it's not designed for people that don't understand what they're doing around APIs and specifically TFS API. So I do have a lot of people who don't understand those things, who do use it, but if they run into trouble, there's no safety net for them, right? It's not commercial tooling. It's not commercial tooling.
So for those people who are on Azure DevOps Server and they want to get to the cloud, besides following the documentation for the Microsoft tool, what are the things that they should expect to have difficulty with when just running the Microsoft tools? What are the typical gaps where they should kind of expect this to happen?
So the process, and I'm going to use a terminology, source and target, right? Because that's the way I think about it in the tools. The process that's used in your source and target should be the same. So if your source is the Agile templates and your target is the Scrum template, you're going to have a whole world of hurt.
Not going to work.
Because the fields don't match up, right? We're not doing anything clever. We just iterate through each field, and if the field exists in the target, update it. That's it. So you would just lose a bunch of data. But we do have field mappers that allow you to map fields and value mappers for so if you've got a drop-down list and it's 1 to 5 over here and it's small, medium, large over here, how do you want to map them? So we have a bunch of tools that you can kind of plug in to do those mappings, but that's a lot of work. It's easier if the process is in the way you expect it to be. So having the same process on both sides is a good start. You are going to lose some data. There's certain things you're absolutely going to lose. So we can't. We're using the old object model APIs. You may be not familiar with it, but TFS has two APIs. TFS ADO has 2 APIs. It has the old original SOAP APIs that used the object model and pushed XML around. And then it has the newer REST APIs, which is JSON data is pushing around. The old APIs are no longer supported by Microsoft. They're all marked as obsolete, although I do get a little bit of support from them. But they work consistently in every version of TFS all the way back to the beginning.
Because they haven't changed.
Because they haven't changed. Whereas for every single call you make to the REST APIs, you have to know which version you're calling. And you get different stuff back depending on which version you're calling. So really, realistically, you can only use the REST APIs consistently against Azure DevOps.
Okay.
Because it always runs the latest. And if something errors out, you go fix it to the latest, and then you continue running it again. But the object model doesn't change. And it hasn't changed in like 8 years. So it's totally consistent.
Yeah.
But it is limited, right? It doesn't do all of the things that the new REST API can do. So that means that... like, for example, we can't migrate test results. We can't migrate builds or pull requests. We can't, even if I was using the REST API, I don't think I could do that either. But there's loads of bits of data that are going to be missing. But when we're migrating a work item, we have to do the history of the work item, and then we do the links and attachments. So the links and attachments are added in today's date because you can't change the date back in time for links and attachments adding, but you can for the work item. So you've got a pseudo history for your work item, right?
Okay.
You've got all of the original write, all of the revisions, and then you'll have a couple of extra ones on the top because we've had to go fix some stuff at the end.
Yeah.
So it's not a like for like. It's definitely not a like for like. The only way you get like is using Microsoft's tooling.
Well, for someone who's gonna give it a go and they've never done it before, maybe they don't have a huge project collection. They're using Azure DevOps Server, a TFS, and they're going to reach for the Microsoft tools first because that's what you're about.
Yep, absolutely.
What should they expect? What should they expect to come over absolutely cleanly, and what should they expect to just not come over at all? And what should they expect to have to, just put in some more effort and fill in the gaps?
So in Microsoft's documentation, talk about it not being a full fidelity migration when you use their tools, right? But as far as I'm concerned, that's butt covering, right?
Okay.
It is fidelity. I'm sure there's something under the covers that I might not have noticed, but for every user of your system, it's pretty much full fidelity. So the things to watch out for there is you have to be on the latest version of TFS or one back, and that's including service pack. So they only support the latest service pack and one back. And you have to run a validator against your TFS instance to make sure that it doesn't have any broken bits to make the import work. Same way as, make sure the process is the same on both sites. And then there's two ways you can do the import. If your TFS is not super big, if your collection database, if you're going to DAC pack it, right? Because you have to DAC pack it. If it's going to be under 100 gig, you can just sequence your database into a DAC pack using SQL Server tools, upload your DAC pack into blob storage, and then give Microsoft the keys to the blob storage and they'll import it, right? That's the super easy way.
Okay.
If your database is bigger than 100 gig, the output, the DAC pack, is going to be bigger than 100 gig, and the validator will tell you. You effectively have to spin up a VM in Azure with SQL Server on it, back up your databases, restore your entire TFS instance. You don't need to install TFS, but you need the databases to that server, and then you give Microsoft the keys to the server, and they go load it out. Right. Okay. So, and it's all an automated process. So they're just connecting via SQL Server and pulling the data out.
So it's because they're using the backdoor directly SQL Server to SQL Server that they can do high fidelity because they're not. There's no way they could be generating GUIDs of any kind. Like
they're not using the APIs. Yeah. They're not using the APIs to do this. So we're limited by the APIs that we can use.
Yep.
And I don't think there's any hidden APIs, right? But what they're doing on the back end is just shoving it in a database and making sure it's all valid and then starting up the instance. And they do occasionally they start up the instance and it falls on its ass and you get a notification that it's broken, but the support team go look at it and they go poke whatever it is they need to poke to then get it up or we need to do another go. But yeah, it's pretty fast as well. Like I said, a 2.5 terabyte migration was done. I think we started Friday at 6 p.m. and it was finished Sunday morning.
So you did the VM with a SQL Server database method.
Yes.
With a terabyte
big
database.
VM. Yeah, well, because our difficulty was the upload, which if you're on-prem, right, you're going to have that difficulty of uploading the data. And we did a full backup the week before and uploaded and restored back and then did the incrementals all week. And then on the Friday, we just took a differential and it was like a couple of gig.
Yeah.
Upload the couple of gig, restore it to the SQL Server, and then we're at parity and we can go.
Well, besides just the mechanics of the migration, that right there is going to be tricky because it's just data, and what your migration isn't a start it in the morning, finish it in the evening. You go for multiple days or weeks, and you have people who are continuing to work on the software and changing work items and changing all kinds of things along the way.
So for your live migration, you need to take it down. You take TFS offline, which is why we did it five. We took everything offline 5 p.m. on Friday, right? And then Monday morning, everybody walked in and they had to go configure to set up for the new instance.
But what I hope is encouraging for everyone listening is that element of the migration is no different than migrating any other system that uses a SQL Server on the back end. You would have to do the same type of things because you want to have the absolute latest in the database.
Absolutely. But because we're using the APIs for my tooling, we can do a migration while everybody's using it.
That's true. That's true.
So not only can we do a migration while everybody's using it, but it's a date-based, because I'm also going to caveat my tooling. It can take a long time. Every save with the old APIs takes about 400 milliseconds-ish. And you might have 200 changes to a work item. So that's 200 saves at 400 milliseconds per save.
Yeah.
I've got the data here. I've got some data here. And the average amount of time it takes per work item is 22 seconds.
Just because of all the history?
That's revisions, that's attachments, and links. So attachments, you could put a 550 meg attachment in there and we have to download it and then upload it again, right?
Right.
So average is 22 seconds. which means I just did a migration and we thought it was going to take 2 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
but it actually only took on average, it took about 4 seconds per work item. And that was a live migration. And that's because most of the work items had fewer revisions.
Sure.
They didn't have a lot of attachments, and only a few of the work items had lots of links. So it really depends. But do you like stats? You like stats?
Yeah. Who doesn't?
Yeah. So I have app insights on my tool.
Yep.
People can turn it off when they run it, but by default, it's got app insights. So we do about 1 million work items, 23 million revisions a month through the tool.
That's a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah. That's 19 billion seconds of total runtime. Oof. If you that's 13 million days in a month
for sure.
Runtime. So the big thing to watch out for, I've got a secret tip as well for those that are using the tool. The big thing to watch out for is the rate limiter. Microsoft will actively rate limit you if you poke the APIs too hard to protect all the other users on the system.
Mm-hmm.
And you will hit the rate limiter if you're using my tooling for anything more than 1,000 work items.
Okay.
Like I just did 80,000, and we hit the rate limiter.
Mm-hmm.
But if you assign the account that's doing the migration, if you assign it a test license for Azure DevOps, it massively multiplies the rate limiter.
Nice.
The calls that you get.
Okay.
That's a way to avoid as much as you can the rate limiter. So that would be my tip. Have a test license assigned and run the migration under that account. Oh, and always run on a VM in Azure as close to the target environment as possible, because we effectively make one call to the source or very few calls to the source, and we make tons of calls to the target.
Right. That's good advice, because you're inside the Azure network. You're having to do tons of HTTPS round trips, and there's no way going from any other outside Azure source that's going to be faster than that.
Some customers really struggle because they don't have access to their TFS local TFS server from Azure, right?
Right. Sure.
So they're going to struggle with that. We are working on some new features. They don't have a expected delivery date, right? But what we plan on doing is changing the system so that it only uses the REST APIs. That will give us more capability, and only does ADO to ADO, so cloud to cloud.
Okay.
But it will also have a capability to use a file storage as a source for the work items, and then we're going to write a TFS exporter that exports your TFS server to the file system. Then you take it over to where you're going to run it, and then we import from those files.
Because it does take so long.
Yeah, that way we can move to the new APIs, so we can do more stuff. We get more capability, and we can also move to .NET 8, which we can't because the old APIs are only 3.5. That's it. That's your tool bag. So that's really limiting for us. So we need to get them out of the systems. We need an exporter that's separate, that's 3.5, and then do everything else in the REST APIs. But that's going to take us some time to get there.
Oh, sure.
And it will depend. It will depend on who hires me to do migrations, because you spend a lot of time when you're doing migrations watching it scrolling, right? Because it's doing the migration. So I use that time to augment, update, enhance the tooling.
Sure.
Because that's the time I'm paid to look at it, right? So,
right. For sure. For sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a ton of great information, Martin. And you have been in the trenches more than anyone else I'm aware of just all the different nuances and everything that could go right and wrong and sideways.
You know, Jeffrey, I haven't been paid to code in 10 years, and I haven't been paid to do tech work for 6 years. I do this for fun. I've been doing a couple of engagements. I've got a new baby in the house.
Congratulations.
We've got an 8 week, 7.5 week old in the house. and I'm taking the time to do some migrations to give me a little bit more time, not in meetings, right?
Right.
It's just I do this for fun.
Well, and you say you haven't done that code, but I mean, the GitHub repository is a ton of .NET code, and not just regular code, but integration code, and you've got automated tests. I mean, you've been doing a lot of coding.
Sure. We've had 622 releases since we started it on GitHub in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
We do continuous delivery to production. We've got 2 versions of the app. Yep. It's totally automated from code commit to at least getting to the preview version. We've got a fair few changes. 104 contributors. So if you are out there and you're going to use the tools and you find a bug, fork it, fix the bug, and submit a pull request. I think there's a pull request waiting for me as well. I just saw that there's one sitting there, and it looks like oh no,
there's 2 pull requests.
Okay, yeah, they're both me.
Oh, they're both you.
They're both me. Yeah.
Well, let's see if you think that they're worthy.
I know the one that's open is worthy, but the other one is I'm actually working with the product group on the dates must be increasing one, because we've got some weird race condition bug in ADO for that. And then there's another one which I'm working with the team. Oh, yeah. The biggest pain at the moment, because people do it more often now. In ADO, TFS, you can't do this, but in ADO, you can move work items from one server to another, one project to another.
Yep.
Right? What happens if you move a work item from project A to project B, and then you delete project A? The REST APIs work great. The object model APIs just crap out and give you errors. So we've got an open issue. I'm working with them on that to hopefully resolve for folks. But if people are going from TFS to the cloud, it works fine.
Yeah, got it. Well, Martin, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing with us all about migrating from Azure DevOps instances to the cloud. We really appreciate it.
You're very, very welcome.
And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.